so welcome everyone to another class here with us at Drisha. So happy to have you. Today's class is the Poetics of Mishnah, themes and structures. The class was being co-taught by Rabbi Dr. Avram Walfish and Rabbi Dr. Adina Sternberg. Today we have Rabbi Avram Walfish with us. This class is part of Drisha's ongoing Mishnah project dedicated to the memory of a great lover and student of Mishnah, Rivka Rosenwein, Zichronah Livracha. Just a couple words about how we run the class. Please keep yourself muted when you're not actively engaging, and then you can feel free to unmute whenever you would like to ask a question or make a comment. If you're joining now as we speak, I'll be sending you an invitation to become a panelist. If you'd like to be able to engage in class verbally, just accept the invitation. That would also allow you to show us your face if you wish. You can also keep your video off. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Walfish.
Thank you very much. Okay, here, let's share the screen here. Where did we go here? Okay, good afternoon. For me, it's afternoon. For many of you, I assume it's morning, everyone. And as you can hear, I am not in the best of health, but Bezrat Hashem, my doctor's note didn't prevent me from teaching a Zoom class, so we'll carry on. Okay, what I discussed in my last class a few weeks ago was how to connect chapters. Okay, in the last semester, for those of you who attended the last semester, we focused mostly on how chapters are structured. Chapters and units within chapters. And now we're focusing on larger units. So last time we talked about how two chapters can interact with one another. And now we're going to look at the next larger unit, which is what I call a division. In Hebrew, I call it a chativa. Okay, so the chativa, the first chativa we'll be examining is the first three chapters of Brachot. Okay, I intentionally come back again and again to Brachot, not just because I wrote a book on Brachot, but also because for two other reasons. First of all, I think it's good, on the one hand, try to give examples from other masechtot so that we can see we're not just talking about a flash in the pan phenomenon for one particular masechet. We're talking about redactorial tools of the Mishnah redactor that run throughout the Mishnah. But on the other hand, it's good to come back to familiar material. And if we keep on coming back to Brachot, so along the way of understanding something methodological about how Mishnah is structured and how Mishnah can be studied, we'll also get more of a sense of this particular tractate. Okay, so we've touched on Masechet Brachot earlier when we talked about connecting chapters. One of our examples was Brachot 4 and 5. Last semester we also dealt with some materials from Brachot. And at the end of the course, we'll also be coming back once again to looking at the overall structure of Masechet Brachot. Here we'll take a look at one of the building blocks. Last time we actually looked at the second of the building blocks, chapters 4 and 5 are also a division. So whatever we taught then is in a way relevant now as well. Okay, but Brachot 1 to 3 is a slightly larger division, 3 chapters. You can find larger divisions in Mishnah. Okay, you can find 2-chapter divisions like Brachot 4-5, and there are many such examples in Mishnah. And you can find divisions that go up to 5 or 6 chapters, and sometimes even more. But here we're taking a 3-chapter division. On the one hand, it's not the minimal size of 2 chapters. On the other hand, it's also not so big as to be unwieldy. So just to get our feet wet and start to see what we're going to try to investigate here. So I gave you a chart giving you a kind of thumbnail sketch of the different topics discussed in Brachot 1 through 3. The overall topic, of course, is Kriyat Shema. That is the overall topic, just as the overall topic of 4-5 is the Amidah prayer. Okay, but we can note that the 3 chapters are different from one another. And I think it would be worthwhile to, as we sort of survey the different topics that are discussed in these 3 chapters, I think it would be worthwhile to give some thought to what the rationale might be for each of these chapters to be separate from the other one. So chapter 1, you have Shema recited evening and morning. That's 2 Mishnayot. Shema lying or standing or in his own way. But we can add there as well that according to the opinion of Beit Shammai, the posture for reciting Kriyat Shema is a function of whether it's in the evening or the morning. Okay, that's something we noted last semester when we looked at Brachot chapter 1. Benedictions of Shema morning and evening, mentioning Exodus at night. What's the overall theme here? What aspect of Kriyat Shema is presented in this chapter?
The time.
Right, the time, and let's add to that something.
Mentioning Exodus at night. The different, that's so hard to summarize.
That's right, it's hard, but let's make a stab at it. You took an important first step.
The protocols for saying it, how about?
Okay, good. And let's now interrelate the two. How the time of reciting Kriyat Shema impacts on, okay, you called it the protocols, but let's fine tune that a little bit.
Go ahead.
Okay, in Mishnah 1 and 2, question is fine tuning the definition of the time. In Mishnah 3, it's the question, the fundamental question that divides Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai is, does the time of recitation affect the posture? Which in turn seems to depend on the question of, are you essentially reciting the same Kriyat Shema twice? Just once in the morning or once in the evening? Or are you reciting 2 different, you're actually doing 2 completely different, or maybe not completely different, but somewhat different liturgical acts. You may be reciting the same contents in the morning and the evening, but you're using them to convey something somewhat different. There are different nuances. Now, I believe, for reasons that I'm not going to go into, that Beit Hillel agrees The Kriyat Shema in the morning and in the evening are not the same.
Mhm.
He just thinks that that does not get expressed in the posture. Posture expresses a different aspect of Kriyat Shema, which is that Kriyat Shema is integrated into your daily activity.
Mhm. Oh,
So that's why there is no special posture for Kriyat Shema, not in the morning, not in the evening. But Beit Hillel would agree in principle that were there to be a particular recommended posture for Kriyat Shema, they would agree with Beit Shammai that in the morning, the evening, it really should be different.
mhm.
The evening, you lie down. You're expressing something by lying down. You're expressing that nighttime is a time of rest. It's a time of vulnerability. It's a time of committing yourself to the guarding and care of God. In the
Mhm.
morning, you stand because you are preparing yourself for your daily activity. You open that activity with Kriyat Shema,
Mhm.
and you stand in order to say, ready and willing to do what needs to be done.
Mhm.
Right? Then the benedictions of Shema morning and evening, again, there are 3 benedictions in the morning, 4 in the evening. The extra one in the evening is again a benediction for requesting divine protection,
Hmm.
right? So that echoes the idea that we attributed to Beit Shammai in the previous Mishnah. And then, do you or do you not mention the Exodus at night? So again, if mentioning the Exodus is a part and parcel of Kriyat Shema, that's certainly appropriate during the day. Is it also appropriate at night? So what we're examining is how this seemingly identical text of Kriyat Shema that you recite twice daily, how is it impacted and what different nuances does it have when you recite it in the morning and in the evening? That's chapter number 1. And note the focus is mostly on appurtenances, background, the time, the posture, the blessings, the Exodus. We're not focusing so much on the content of Kriyat Shema per se. We move to chapter 2, and that's where we're going to start talking about the contents. But before getting into the contents, the Mishnah opens with intention. And intention carries with it as well the question of interruption. If I have to be intent on reciting Shema, then I shouldn't interrupt it in order to say hello to somebody or respond to somebody. Okay, but and the Mishnah, in fact, does restrict that, although not forbid it altogether. It allows it, but only under restricted circumstances. And then the Mishnah gets into what are the sections of Kriyat Shema. And here, interestingly, it's not just the 3 parashiot, but the 3 parashiot flanked by the brachot. That's the content of Kriyat Shema. And the Mishnah then explains the logical arrangement of the contents of Shema. Okay, accepting the yoke of heaven, and only afterwards accepting the yoke of commandments. And then afterwards you have tzitzit, which the Mishnah doesn't really explain why that's there. But I think we can readily understand it, because tzitzit is something that serves as a constant reminder to carry out the mitzvot. So first we accept upon ourselves the mitzvot. It's a kind of renewal of Ma'amad Har Sinai, of the revelation at Sinai. We accept God's kingship. We then accept his mitzvot. And then in the 3rd paragraph, we also we also put something on our clothing to remind us that we are always obliged to do the mitzvah. Then the Mishnah turns to the precision that's required for reciting Shema. Okay, you have to enunciate the words out loud. How clearly do you have to enunciate them? What if you make a mistake? You have to go back and correct it. Okay, then then we go back to the notion of intention. Workers do recite Kriyat Shema at their workplace. In other words, the requirement of intention is not so intense that we would say the worker can't really concentrate properly on Kriyat Shema. But interestingly, here already, in the middle of chapter 2, already the Mishnah adds in a little caveat at the end that prayer is different. Okay, and this will become a major theme of Masechet Brachot later on, that the that intention for Kriyat Shema and intention for prayer are they're both required, but they're a very, very different level of intention. And then that theme continues with the exemption of a bridegroom on the night of his wedding from reciting Kriyat Shema, and Rabban Gamliel refusing to abide by that. Says, no way. I am going to accept upon myself the kingdom of heaven, and I don't care what any of you guys say. Quote halachot to me doesn't interest me. Then there's a kind of digression with additional Rabban Gamliel narratives where he seems to write his own personal halakha and explain. In these cases, he explains why he thinks he's an exception. And then at the end of this section, we have an interesting Mishnah that sort of tries to bring this back into the halakhic framework by saying, what if some other bridegroom besides Rabban Gamliel decides, oh, I can also concentrate properly even on my wedding night? So the sages say, well, that's okay. Presumably they're saying, once Rabban Gamliel opened the floodgates, so anybody can do that. And a sage named Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, no, not anybody can do that. Okay, in other words, not every schnook can compare himself to my father. My father, when he says he can concentrate properly, we accept it. When somebody else does that, then we think it's, he's showing off, trying to show, oh yes, I'm a very pious person too. So we say, you know what, better off not. Shouldn't get into that. So there are two overall themes in chapter 2, which are the precision, the form, the content, the text on the one hand, and the meaning and inner intention on the other hand. And clearly the Mishnah is inviting us to see how these two things fit together. So chapter 2 is really a chapter with a very different focus than chapter 1. And chapter 3 is a bit challenging. Chapter 3 starts with Shema obligation or exemption during funeral. Now that reminds us of something from chapter 2. There seems to be a kind of footnote to what?
Kavanah, concentration.
Right. It's a footnote to Kavanah. It's also a footnote specifically to for a bridegroom on the night of his wedding. Okay, wedding, funeral. These are like the two extremes. Okay, now during a funeral, we're not talking only about the mourners themselves. Okay, in funeral, we're also talking about other participants, when and how they might be able to recite Shema. Okay, then Mishnah 3 talks about sort of moves in a completely new direction, apparently. Women, slaves, and minors, okay, are obligated in certain liturgical mitzvot and exempt from other liturgical mitzvot. Okay, and two of the central mitzvot that are discussed here are Shema and prayer. Okay, then Mishnah 4 talks about if a man has experienced a seminal emission. Okay, so in the time of Chazal, people who experienced seminal emissions were supposed to, not because of reasons of impurity. Impure people are allowed to learn Torah, they're allowed to recite brachot, they're allowed to daven, but particularly seminal emissions, okay, so seminal emissions which indicate a person's preoccupation in his mind, okay, with more mundane matters. Okay, so before studying Torah, reciting blessings, or praying, he should immerse himself in a mikvah. Okay, so now the question is, if he hasn't gotten to a mikvah yet, is there some way he can fulfill the mitzvah of Shema? Okay, so the Mishnah talks about how he might be able to think about it. So it's just think the words in his head without actually reciting them. Okay, then we continue that theme in the 5th Mishnah, which we'll take a closer look at a bit further down the line. The person is in the middle of prayer, and then he all of a sudden remembers that, oops, I had a seminal emission. Why, I shouldn't be praying right now. Okay, and then as a kind of addendum to that, how a person should be properly clothed when reciting Shema and should be in a proper environment. Okay, okay, and then finally, a kind of a footnote to that theme in the last Mishnah. So that's our rundown of the 3 chapters. So now, how would we summarize chapter 3? Chapter 3 is harder to summarize than the other 2 chapters because it's really a potpourri of different topics. We started off with the funeral, which is a kind of footnote to chapter 2. We continue with women, slaves, and minors, which is a completely new theme. Okay. We continue with seminal emissions and related concepts such as nudity or disgusting environment, filth, how that impacts. The way I would describe it in general, perhaps with the exception of Mishnah 3, is when there are factors that can interfere with reciting Kriyat Shema. So it's true, we had some of that in chapter 2, but we focused on it more clearly in chapter 3, and particularly physical situations that would compromise a person's ability to recite Shema. Now, how Mishnah 3 fits into that is a large topic that we can't go into whatsoever, especially since it's a it's a very potentially explosive topic. So we'll have to leave that for some other occasion. Okay, but that's what chapter 3 talks about. So we have a division, 3 chapters. Each chapter seems to have its own character, its own focus. what does the Mishnah do to try to bring them all together? Okay, make them into some kind of cohesive. Okay, so what I'd like to start off with is an important tool in the toolbox of the Mishnah redactor is inclusio, envelope structure. And there's some very, very interesting parallels between the first two Mishnayot of this division, beginning of chapter 1, and the all but final. Okay, there's one final Mishnah, number 6, that I left out because it doesn't have a real parallel. But Mishnayot 4 and 5 of chapter 3 have some very, very interesting parallels to the opening Mishnayot. Now let's start off, first of all, with a common phrase that they share, and that is ad hanetz hachama. At the end, or not quite the end of Mishnah 2, but somewhere in the middle of Mishnah 2. Mishnah 2 says, until when do you recite Shema during the day? Until sunrise, hanetz hachama. And if you look at Mishnah Hey in Perek Gimel, okay, so let's take a look at this Mishnah. We haven't we haven't really discussed it. So let's look a little more closely at this Mishnah to see what we have to say about it. Yarad litbo. Okay, so you have a man who's experienced a seminal emission. He immerses himself in a mikvah, and then he all of a sudden looks up and says, oh my gosh, it's almost sunrise. So im yachol la'alotul hitkasot. So what does he have to do in order to recite Shema? So ideally what he should do is emerge from the mikvah, clothe himself, at least minimally, vilikrot, and then he can recite Shema. If he's able to do all of that, ad shalot hanetz hachama, until the sun rises, okay, so that's where the common phrase occurs, right? Hanetz hachama appears in the entire tractate only in these two places. Not all that common elsewhere in Mishnah either. Okay, so if so, then that's what he should do. That's ideal. Okay, the Mishnah then continues and says, if he doesn't have enough time to do it, and what will happen if the sun has risen? It's too late. You can't recite Great Shema, at least according to the first opinion in the Mishnah in chapter 1. We don't follow that opinion. We follow the opinion that you can recite Shema until the 3rd hour, okay? Because there are late risers. In the time of the Mishnah, that would be princes. Princes would arise later in the morning. So that's still called a time of arising, and it's still time for reciting Shema. That's the opinion we follow, but this Mishnah is clearly reflecting the other opinion. Okay? If he will not manage to get out of the mikvah, cover himself, and recite in time before the sun has risen, what he should do is rile up the water, and that will be considered, in this situation of b'diavad, that would be enough to cover his nakedness. Okay, you have something similar, when women go to the mikvah. When do they recite the bracha, right? So it's this is one of the sources for that practice, right? So okay, so now what do we have here? We have Hanetz Hachama is repeated, but it's not just Hanetz Hachama that's repeated. There's something else. There are a few other things that connect this passage towards the end of chapter 3 with the passage at the beginning of chapter 1. First of all, this is the one place in all of chapter 3 where we talk about the time of Kriyat Shema. Time of Kriyat Shema was discussed at the beginning of chapter 1. It appears again at the beginning of chapter 2, because chapter 2, okay, you can look at at the next chart, and I've shown here connections between each chapter and each other chapter. Okay, so you see that chapter 1 opens with, what is the time of Kriyat Shema? Chapter 2 opens with, if I'm studying Torah and the time of Kriyat Shema arrives, if I direct my heart, then I fulfill the mitzvah. So the time of Kriyat Shema is mentioned incidentally at the beginning of chapter 2. That's one of the connections between these two chapters. That's the only place it's mentioned in chapter 2. And now in chapter 3, the only place where the time of Kriyat Shema is at all alluded to is Mishnah 5. So Hanetz Hachama is not just the same time that's mentioned in Mishnah Bet in chapter 1. Hanetz Hachama is also an expression of a theme that was central at the beginning of the section, and that now recurs at the end of the section. The time of Kriyat Shema has again become a very crucial factor at the end of this division. Okay, but there's more. Let's go back to the person, okay, went down to immerse himself in a mikvah. Is there any allusion to a mikvah at the beginning of the division? Well, let's look at the opening. From when do you recite Shema in the evening? The expected answer is from nightfall. That's the expected answer. Tzeta kochavim. Instead, the Mishnah identifies nightfall in a rather oblique fashion. Misha'ah shakohanim nichnasim le'echol b'trumatan. From the time that the Kohanim enter to eat their truma. Why do Kohanim enter? First of all, where are they entering? And why are they entering this place at nightfall? Now, why is it that in order to know when nightfall is, you can sort of have this sign that everyone look out and see, when are the Kohanim entering in order to eat the truma? So the answer is, the Kohanim, before they would eat truma, they would immerse themselves in a mikvah. Why? Because if the Kohanim became impure during the day, they have to purify themselves. But in order to eat truma, purification requires more than immersing in a mikvah. In order to eat truma, purification requires nightfall. That's why the Kohanim are probably entering the city. They probably went to a mikvah outside the city. They all went just before sundown. They figured at the very last possible moment, okay, they'll they'll immerse themselves to cover any possible impurity they may have contracted during the day. And when they emerge from the mikvah, in another few minutes, it will already be nightfall, so they'll already be pure and they can eat their truma. So what are we talking about effectively? We're talking about kohanim who have immersed themselves in the mikvah. So we open with an oblique allusion to kohanim who have immersed themselves in the mikvah. And we close with an explicit discussion of even non-kohanim to recite Shema have to immerse themselves in a mikvah if they've had seminal emissions. So that's another connection between the beginning of the division and the end of the division. Okay, now the most likely thing that the Kohen would become defiled by is to be a Balkari. He had relations with his wife, for example. That's the likeliest thing that would require him to immerse himself in a mikvah. So that's also a possible connection, and two further connections. Okay, one other connection is the Kohen immersed himself in a mikvah, and then he's entering in order to eat. He's entering in order to eat. Well, in chapter 3, starting already in Mishnah 3 and moving on into Mishnah 4, Kriyat Shema and blessings over food are interrelated. And so, if the beginning of the division compares the Kohanim eating truma to the Jew reciting Kriyat Shema, towards the end of this division, we compare the Jew reciting Kriyat Shema with the Jew reciting blessings over his food. Okay, so that's another connection. And finally, there's another common word here, and that is halakhic, in two completely different senses. Okay, at the beginning of the division, okay, the reason the Chachamim limited recitation of Shema until midnight, even though technically you could do it all night, is to distance a person from transgression. And towards the end of Mishnah Hey, if a person is in the vicinity of foul, disgusting things, how far does he have to distance himself before he can recite Kriyat Shema? Okay, now we don't really have time to reflect in detail on what these connections really represent, but I'll just throw out one general thought that you can reflect upon, and that is that that what we see is that Kriyat Shema is not just about some kind of abstract idea of accepting upon ourselves the kingdom of heaven. Okay, Kriyat Shema is also about our physicality, about our being rooted in the physical world. And it starts off with what the Kohanim do when they eat Truma, and what the Jew does when he recites Shema are somehow the same. The Kohen serves God by eating sanctified foods. Okay, the common Jew serves God by accepting the yoke of heaven. But he should be aware that of this like physical groundedness okay, of his acceptance of the oak of heaven. And that then comes back in spades at the end of the division. At the end of the division, we say, well, there's a downside to the physicality. Physicality can sometimes interfere. Okay, physicality is fine. We want to sanctify the physical. Part of sanctifying the physical is to separate ourselves from the impure, from the disgusting. Okay, and so the immersion at the beginning that the Kohanim are supposed to do to eat the truma. So at the time we thought that was just a fairly far-fetched analogy to Kriyat Shema. At the end, we discover, no, for Kriyat Shema, you also have to immerse yourself. Okay, because you have to have a certain physical integrity, okay, and certain level of purity, or at least spiritual purity, in order to recite Shema. Okay, there's a chart here that I'll send it out after the class. You can see many other ways in which these chapters are interrelated. Okay, without going through them one by one, you can see a whole slew of parallels between chapter 1 and chapter 2, and then a whole slew of parallels between chapter 2 and chapter 3, and then the parallels we've already looked at between chapter 1 and chapter 3. Okay, so the inclusio is, I think, the most prominent feature of how the Mishnah redactor weaves these chapters together into a coherent whole. But as I say, you see his redactorial strategy running through the entire division. You see how each chapter, okay, even though it's developing new themes, but it weaves in certain motifs from other chapters. Okay, so let's move on to our second example. Here we're going to talk about a much larger division, but it's actually a very, very cohesive division. I mean, in this case, we're not all surprised that it's a cohesive division, because Yoma comprises basically two parts. One part is chapter 8, the last chapter, which talks about more or less Yom Kippur for us, fasting, the other afflictions. When are there leniencies applicable for the obligation of fasting, and so on. And then towards the end of the chapter, the ideas of atonement and repentance, and how those ideas interrelate. And that's all chapter 8. The first 7 chapters are all one, basically you can call it narrative unit, because like many other sections in the Mishnah that describe temple service, it's presented not in prescriptive language, but in descriptive language. The Kohen does this, the Kohen does that. They would bring the Kohen this, and the Kohen would respond by doing that. Okay, it's presented basically as a narrative. Okay, and the narrative is what we call today the Seder Avodah. Okay, we recite different versions of it as part of our Musaf prayer on Yom Kippur. But the Mishnah is the first full-fledged Seder Avodah. Okay, it spells out how exactly it would take place. Okay, so now we're not going to read through all 7 chapters, obviously. Okay, but The first chapter starts with how the Kohen Gadol is supposed to prepare himself 7 days in advance of Yom Kippur. He's separated from his house. Now, this term house, as we'll see in a couple of minutes, is a key word with many different meanings and ramifications. He's separated from his house to an office or a chamber in the temple compound called the Lishkat Parhedrin. Okay, and then they would also prepare a replacement just in case. Part of the purpose of separating him for these 7 days, part of it is to prepare him, to prepare him spiritually, what's about to happen, for him to understand the magnitude, the gravity of what is about to happen. Okay, but part of it is also to keep him pretty safe from exposure to anything that would defile him or disqualify him. But just in case, so another Kohen is appointed to step in at the last minute if he should be disqualified. And then Rabbi Yehuda says, since the Kohen Gadol must be married, because the Torah says, "V'chiper bado v'ad beito," so it means he has to have a household. Household means, at the very minimum, a wife. And so if the Kohen Gadol, for whatever reason, is unmarried, okay, bachelor, obviously, would never be appointed, but a widower, let's say, okay, he can't serve. So Rabbi Yehuda says, what if his wife drops dead, chas v'shalom, at the last minute? Okay, so appoint a substitute wife who can sub for the real wife at that last minute, so he'll be able to serve. And the Chachamim say, that's taking things too far. Okay, go like that. So what if the substitute wife also drops dead? Right? That's what they mean when they say "ein ladavar sof." I mean, we call that OCD, right? So that's essentially what the Chachamim are saying to Rabbi Yehuda. Enough with your OCD. We'll be concerned about like real concerns, things that are really very far-fetched, like his wife dropping dead at the last minute. That's not something we're going to concern ourselves about. Okay, so then the Mishnayot discuss what does he do during the 7 days. Mishnah Gimel tells us that, okay, that there are elders from the Beit Din. Now, let's go back for a minute to the first Mishnah. I told you the word bayit is a key word. What does the word bayit mean in the first Mishnah? They separate the Kohen Gadol from his house, or possibly
his wife.
Yeah, possibly household. Because look at the end of the Mishnah, where Rabbi Yehuda says, "Bado va'ad beito, beito zo ishto." Are we separating the Kohen Gadol from his wife? That actually makes a lot of sense. He's hanging out with his wife. Maybe he'll be tempted to have a little fling, a little bit too late in the day, right? So it actually makes sense to separate him from his wife. But if we're separating him from his house to the office, to the chamber in the Mikdash, it sounds more like a physical house, right? The structure, okay? Not the household, but the house. But certainly later in the Mishnah, Beito means his household. Now let's look at Mishnah Gimel. Word bayit comes up again. The house of judgment, the court. We call it a court, but in Hebrew they call it the house of judgment. And that's clearly a social grouping. Okay, let's move on a little further, and we'll say, and we'll see in Mishnah Hey. Okay, after elders from the high court were given to the Kohen Gadol to accompany him during his 7-day journey, preparing himself for Yom Kippur. So in Mishnah 5, the Ziknei Beit Din, those are the ones from Mishnah Gimel, what do they now do? They give him over to Ziknei Kuna, to the elders of the priests. This is an interesting topic we don't have time for, but the relationship between sages and priests in the temple service within the Mishnah and more generally within Chazal is a very interesting topic in its own right. But for the first 3 days, we want the sages to be in charge of him. They're the ones who are going to oversee that he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows how to do the service properly and so on. But then we come to Mishnah 5, and this is after in Mishnah 4, we're already getting towards the end of Erev Yom Kippur, Im Chashecha. So we say it's late in the day on Erev Yom Kippur, don't eat a lot because you might fall asleep. And if you fall asleep, you might have a seminal emission. And so the chapter continues and talks about how they worked very hard at keeping him up all night. Make sure he would not fall asleep. Okay? And the main reason for that was to make sure that he would not become disqualified by the morning. Okay? And now, at that juncture, the officials from the court will now hand him over to the elders of the Kuhuna, okay, the elders of the priests. And they took him to Beit of Tinas, okay, another chamber in the Mikdash called Beit of Tinas. So notice how he's moving from one house to another. As he progresses through that week, he moves from his own house and household to the chamber of Palhedrin. He's given over to the house of judgment, the Beit Din. They in turn hand him over at the end of that week to the Ziknei Kuna, who take him to the house of Avtinas in the Mikdash. So he's moving steadily up the ladder from one house to another. Okay, Hishbiyuhu v'nifteru v'alchu lahem. And the Ziknei Beit Din then at that point said to him, okay, from now, we're not supervising you anymore. Now, the ones who are going to supervise you are the Ziknei Kuna. And they say, okay, my master, the Kohen Gadol, we are the representatives of the Beit Din, and you are our representative and the representative of Beit Din. So the Kohen Gadol is to remember that when he goes the next day to perform the sacrificial service, he is the emissary of Beit Din. He represents the Beit Din. That house will be accompanying him as he does the service. And now we come to, I think, the most impressive use of the term bayit. Mashpiim anu alecha b'mi sheshikein et shmo b'bayit hazeh. Very unusual language for for an oath. You're supposed to take an oath by the name of God. But how is God termed here? God is the one who caused his name to dwell in this house. Now, the name, God's name, is going to be a very, very central theme. We all know that from our Seder Avodah as part of the Matzah, right? How central the name of God is in service. Okay? But for our purposes, what's more crucial is the one who caused his name to dwell in this house. What is he in effect saying? You are now about to go into the house of all houses. You've been moving all week from one house to another. And now finally, before we depart and hand you over to the Ziknei Kuna, we want you to understand that that you are now going to be the man of this house, the house in which God's name dwells, which is another way of impressing upon him just how solemn, how serious, how challenging, how daunting this mission of his is going to be. And then they say, and we adjure you. Okay, this is what the oath is about. Do not change a thing from what we instructed you. And the main thing that they instructed him was there was a very fundamental dispute between the Pharisees and the Sadducees as to how the Kohen Gadol, when he enters the Holy of Holies, is supposed to offer the incense offering. Okay, and so what they're saying is make sure to do it the way we told you and not the way the Sadducees want to do it. Okay, and that's what the oath is about. Okay, so then they separate and weep because they had to cast suspicion upon him, and he separates and weeps because he in fact was suspected by them. And finally, last Mishnah from the first chapter we're going to look at is how would they keep him up all night? If he was, not all Kohanim Gedolim were necessarily Talmidei Chachamim. So if he was a Chacham, so then he can spend all night giving a shiur, doresh, can expound from his fountains of knowledge. Vim Talmid Chachamim, Doshim Lefanav. If he himself is not a Chacham who can expound, he's just the disciple of Chachamim, so then they can teach him a nice Lamda Shashir. Vim Ragil Likrot Korei. And if he is accustomed to reading from the scriptures, so then he can read from the scriptures. Vimlav Korin Lefanav. And if he himself is not accustomed to read from the scriptures, others will read before him. Now let's look at the last chapter. So the first thing we'll see in the last chapter is the very end of the whole Seder Avodah is he once again purifies his hands and feet and removes his special vestments. He puts on his own everyday clothes and wears them. Mulavimoto ad Beito. So how does Yoma close the circle? When he returns to his house. And I think it's very striking that the first thing we do is separate him from his house, but make sure that his house is with him. His household, at least, has to be with him. He's aware of them. He includes, when he brings some of the sacrifices, he has to be thinking about, and not only thinking about, he has to include the members of his household in the atonement of that sacrifice. And the conclusion is he goes back to his house, to his household. That closes the circle. I think that's a very striking way of closing the circle here. I think it bears noting that there are some additional connections as well, because let's take it from the top here. Chapter 7 opens with the Kohen Gadol has finished up a major portion of the service, and then he comes to read. Read what? Read from the Torah. Okay, so he can read it wearing either the white linen garments or the special 8-piece high priest vestments. And we're told how the Kohen Gadol will receive the Sefer Torah and read in front of the entire congregation. Okay, so I think that's also a very interesting connection. Okay, so Yom Kippur night he spends reading. Not necessarily reading. He can also study Torah Shebaal Peh. He can doresh, or he can hear somebody else doresh. Okay, but it seems to be an integral part of it. He's not spending all night just on Torah Shebaal Peh. He's spending a good part of the night on Mikra, okay, on Tanakh. Okay, and in chapter 1, they even note what sections of Tanakh were very popular for these Yom Kippur all-nighters. And we close, okay, just before the Kohen Gadol concludes the service and bows off the stage. What does he do? Now he doesn't read for himself. Now he reads for all of Israel. He's the Baal Koreh. He reads the Torah for all of Israel. So Yom Kippur sort of starts with his reading Tanakh for himself, and it closes with his reading the Torah for all of Israel. So I think it's very impressive to see how the Mishnah redactor concludes the story in ways that close the circle, both in terms of the return to the house and in terms of the return to the theme of reading from Scripture. Okay, thank you all.
Okay.
It's phenomenal.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Walfish. Beautiful.
Brilliant. And you did it while suffering. I mean, oh my gosh.
That's the craziest.
Shlema from all of us. Jeez.
Thank you.
Just brilliant.
Yes, very much agreed. And I hope you feel better really, really, really soon, Rabbi Walfish. Thank you so much for another amazing class. And thank you to everyone who joined us for learning together. Remember to check our website for upcoming classes, because we always love seeing you and learning together. And goodness, thank you again, Rabbi Walfish. Get better soon, and we'll be together soon. Lehitraot.
Hey, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Take care.